The winter of 1709 did not behave like a normal season that gradually cools, settles, and then releases its grip. It arrived as a shock to the European continent, an abrupt climatic collapse that transformed everyday life into a continuous struggle for survival. What followed became known in historical records as the Great Frost of 1709, one of the most severe cold events in recorded European history. Unlike ordinary winters, which bring hardship but remain predictable, this event broke expectations entirely, freezing landscapes, economies, and entire food systems simultaneously. The cold began in early January. At first, it seemed like an unusually harsh but manageable winter. Temperatures dropped lower than normal, and frost appeared earlier than expected. But within a matter of days, something unusual happened. The cold intensified instead of stabilizing. Reports from across Europe describe a sudden deep freeze that seemed to descend all at once, as if the atmosphere itself had shifted into a different state. Winds became piercing and dry. Snow did not fall gently, it drove horizontally, pushed by relentless air currents that cut through clothing and structures. By mid-January, the cold had become extreme. In France, Germany, and the Low Countries, rivers began to freeze in ways that surprised even experienced observers. The Seine, the Rhine, and smaller tributaries slowed, thickened, and then locked into ice. Ice formation was not just surface level, it extended deep enough to halt transportation entirely. Boats were trapped. Watermills stopped functioning. Entire economic systems that depended on flowing water came to a sudden halt. Inside homes, people began to notice something far more alarming than inconvenience. Cold was penetrating structures that were supposed to provide protection. Stone buildings, common across Europe, were not designed to retain heat but to endure time and fire. As a result, they became cold reservoirs. Heat generated inside rooms escaped quickly, while external cold seeped inward. Fireplaces burned constantly, but fuel consumption increased to unsustainable levels. In many cities, firewood supplies began to run dangerously low within weeks. One of the most frequently recorded phenomena of this winter was the freezing of liquids stored indoors. Among the most notable examples was wine. Wine cellars across France reported barrels of wine turning thick, slushy, or completely solid. This detail is often repeated in historical accounts because it demonstrates the intensity of the cold in a tangible way. Wine, depending on its alcohol content, typically freezes at temperatures well below water but still within reach of extreme winter conditions. The fact that it froze in storage locations meant that ambient temperatures inside buildings had fallen far below normal survival thresholds. As the cold persisted, transportation collapsed. Roads became unusable not because of deep snow alone, but because the ground itself hardened. Wagons could not move efficiently. Horses struggled to maintain footing. Trade between regions slowed dramatically, then stopped entirely in some areas. This isolation created a secondary crisis: food distribution failure. Before modern storage and logistics systems, European cities relied on constant inflow of agricultural goods. When transport routes froze, cities could not replenish grain reserves. Rural areas, meanwhile, were often too affected by frost to produce surplus food. Crops stored in barns were insufficient to bridge the gap. As days turned into weeks, food scarcity began to emerge in urban centres. In France, the situation became particularly severe. France at the time was already strained by earlier wars and taxation pressures. The population depended heavily on wheat-based diets, especially bread. When grain distribution slowed and prices increased, bread became inaccessible for large portions of society. Bread shortages quickly turned into famine conditions. The cold itself also destroyed agricultural foundations. Winter wheat which should have been dormant but alive beneath the soil, was killed by the extreme frost penetrating deep into the ground. Fruit trees suffered damage to their internal structures, leading to reduced yields in the following year. Vineyards, particularly in northern regions, experienced severe losses as vines froze or became too damaged to recover. Livestock mortality added another layer of crisis. Animals that normally survived European winters struggled under these extreme conditions. Cattle, sheep and horses required more feed than could be provided. When feed ran out, animals weakened quickly. In many cases, they froze in poorly insulated shelters or died from starvation combined with exposure. The loss of livestock was devastating because it removed not only food sources but also labor resources essential for farming and transportation. Human survival became increasingly difficult. People relied heavily on fireplaces, but fuel consumption was enormous. Entire forests near populated regions were rapidly depleted. In some areas, people burned furniture, wooden beams, and household structures just to maintain heat. Even then, warmth was often insufficient. Indoor temperatures dropped close to freezing in many poorly insulated homes. The human body responds to prolonged cold in predictable stages: shivering, reduced circulation, confusion, and eventually hypothermia. During the winter of 1709, many deaths occurred not in dramatic fashion, but gradually, as people succumbed to cold in their sleep or while attempting to travel. Elderly individuals and infants were especially vulnerable. Those without strong shelter or adequate clothing faced the highest risk. As the cold persisted into February and March, secondary disasters emerged. Hunger and disease followed closely behind environmental collapse. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making populations more susceptible to illness. Diseases such as typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections spread rapidly in crowded urban environments. Medical knowledge at the time was extremely limited, so treatments were ineffective and often based on superstition or tradition rather than science. Historical estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of people died across Europe as a result of the combined effects of cold, famine, and disease. The frequently cited figure of approximately 600,000 deaths is not universally agreed upon, but is considered plausible within historical demographic estimates. The difficulty in confirming exact numbers comes from inconsistent record keeping, especially in rural areas where births and deaths were not systematically documented. What makes this event particularly significant is not only its immediate impact, but its long-term consequences. The agricultural failures of 1709 affected the following year as well. Seeds that should have been planted in spring were unavailable or unusable. Recovery was slow because entire production systems had been disrupted simultaneously. Economic instability followed, with food prices remaining high long after the winter ended. Social structures were also affected. In times of extreme scarcity, communities often experience shifts in behavior. Some regions saw increased cooperation, where wealthier households provided aid to poorer neighbours. Religious institutions played a major role in relief efforts, distributing food and shelter where possible. At the same time, desperation also led to theft and social tension in certain areas, reflecting the uneven nature of survival. When spring finally arrived, the thaw revealed the full scale of damage. Dead livestock lay across fields. Crops had been destroyed. Infrastructure was damaged from frost expansion and contraction. Rivers began flowing again, but transportation and trade systems had to be rebuilt. The psychological impact of the winter lingered long after temperatures returned to normal. From a modern perspective, the winter of 1709 serves as a case study in climate vulnerability. It demonstrates how societies dependent on environmental stability can be disrupted by extreme anomalies. Today, with advanced forecasting and global supply chains, such a disaster would likely unfold differently. But in 1709, there was no buffer system capable of absorbing such a shock. The Great Frost remains one of the clearest historical examples of how a single season of extreme weather can reshape human populations. It was not just a cold winter, it was a systemic failure of survival conditions across an entire continent. The freezing of wine barrels is often remembered as a striking detail, but it symbolises something much larger: the collapse of normal life under environmental pressure. The winter of 1709 is remembered not only for its severity, but for what it reveals about human vulnerability. It shows that beneath the structures of civilization, cities, economies, and governments, there remains a fundamental dependence on climate stability. When that stability breaks, even briefly, the consequences can echo across generations.